We now move on to part two of religion in Africa. We start by talking about ritual. A definition of ritual is that it's a structured form of activity related to religious worldview. Within Africa, there are several classes of ritual that are important to African traditional religion. Let's talk about rites of passage as being a set of rituals. First rite of passage would be that of birth. Birth defines anew a person's social, religious, and physical identity. It's the movement from the womb to childhood or birth. There's a belief that births can fail due to religious reasons. As such, women might wear protective charms, observe special taboos, such as abstaining from sex or particular foods. Often, once a child is born, the child and the mother will be secluded after birth, and also there will be special naming ceremonies. The next rite of passage would be puberty and initiation. It's the passage from childhood to adulthood. They're usually separate ceremonies that are held for boys and girls. It's often done as a group. For example, among the Limba of Sierra Leone, they induct boys into a secret society, this process consists of three phases. Number one is seclusion from community. Number two is a period of memorization of various rituals and rites and history, scarification and circumcision. And then phase three is the return back into society as men. Another rite of passage is marriage. It's the transition from adulthood to procreative adulthood. It allows for the creation of children. Ceremonies include a period of seclusion for the couple, dancing, gift exchange, a time for Thanksgiving and prayers, sacrifices, and communal meals. Marriage is seen as creating social relationships, and often their parents arrange for a mate and exchange bride wealth. Polygyny is recognized by large numbers, and marriage is seen as providing social and financial prestige for men and additional help for women. Another rite of passage is death. Death is not seen as the end of human existence, but the death of the physical portion of the human being. The immaterial portions or souls move on and survive in the realm of the ancestors, the living dead. There are varied disposal methods practiced, usually burial, and the type of death and the social status influence the burial that takes place. Graves are often oriented toward the east. Bodies are buried with material goods believed to be helpful in the afterlife. The funerals may last several days, weeks, even months, and include a formal period of mourning. There can be prayer, sacrifices, and post-burial celebration. Let's talk about magic in contemporary culture in Africa. Definition of magic would be using invisible supernatural power to affect people and or events in the visible world. The idea of human agency is the ability to command the spiritual power to the end of one's own choosing rather than to appeal to a deity who may or may not heed one's request. Magic tends to operate in the space of African traditional religion, the local spiritual world, consists of a specialist who manipulates objects, potions, rituals. The manipulation of those objects helps to resolve dilemmas using potion, remedies, incantations, rituals through skill and the ability of the specialist to assert power. For example, in Niger, we can see spirit mediums even now advertising. And I might add, in the days of social media, I very often get messages from spirit mediums and other people purporting to be healers through Instagram and Facebook. We look at the function of magic, the existential service or one's purpose for living. Magic also can serve to explain misfortune. Oftentimes, the blame for misfortune happening is the use of supernatural power by others on a person. And figuring out the why things happen becomes an important part of magic and the role of those practitioners of magic. Evans Pritchard, who did a study of witchcraft among the Zande, talked about with a particular incident that happened, the collapse of a granary. And while it could be said ordinarily that it was caused by termites, but that there were people under it, and because of there being people under it being injured, the explanation was that there was some type of witchcraft that was done as a way of getting revenge or harming those who were underneath it. Magic also functions very often to provide redress and can function as a societal pressure valve. When it comes to redress, that's making right wrongs that might have happened against various people, various things that might have happened, or in terms of revenge through punishment. And magic also can relieve tensions, because when there's conflict and things happen, oftentimes the blame being placed on magic in many ways helps to reduce some of the tensions that are there. Oftentimes it allows for the blame to be placed elsewhere. Globally, African religions have had an impact on the diaspora. There are a number of ways, but we'll just briefly mention Santeria and Vodou, which are two diasporic religions that can be found. Vodou very often is called voodoo, but having its origins in Benin, but Vodou is a more formal title, and it actually is a religion, not the kind that we see characterized by Hollywood as being exotic and all of those things, but it is a very serious system of religious beliefs and practices. We now turn to talking about the role of Christianity in Africa. There were early Christians in both Egypt and in North Africa, contrary to what oftentimes is believed, that Christianity existed on the continent long before missionaries from the West came. In fact, there was a significant influence on Christianity in the part of African. We talk about Christianity in Africa. It's important to note that Africa is close to Palestine, where Christianity started. It spread to Egypt in North Africa in the 1st century CE. We saw already that Alexandria, a city in Egypt, was an important center of this new religion. Our discussion about the African fathers talked a great deal about Alexandria. One important group that was centered in Egypt and influential throughout North Africa were the Gnostics. Gnostic referring to secret teachings or hidden teachings. The Gnostics were at odds with factions that were centered in Rome. The Roman faction was very much influenced by the teachings of the Apostle Paul. They were prominent in the 4th century CE when the Roman Empire officially became Christian. This faction brought together a collection of writings by early Christians and proclaimed these writings were inspired by God and that they were the true testament of the life and teachings of Jesus. This collection is known as the New Testament and is a central part of the Christian Bible. The Roman faction rejected as heresy all other writings about Jesus' life and teachings, including many books written by North African Gnostic Christians. In North Africa, in Egypt, we also see the Coptic Church. It featured monasticism and contemplation. It had a structure similar to Roman Catholicism, including sacraments, priests, bishops, and it's headed by a patriarch who lives in Alexandria. 15% of Egyptian Christians today are a part of the Coptic Church. Early Christians in Nubia, which is modern-day Sudan, were much like the Coptic Church, but by the 16th century, most of them had converted to Islam. In Aksum, which is modern-day Ethiopia, there was a 4th century conversion. There existed an Ethiopian form of Christianity, the same time as the things happen in Europe, that's very similar to the Coptic Church in structure and has also a part of it the existence of monasteries. And then there is the Christianity in the Congo. The Portuguese strategy was to convert leaders, and that met with mixed success. King Alfonso I, the son of the ruler, facilitated conversion in the late 1400s, and with the slave trade in 17th century, it weakened the relationship of Christianity there in the Congo. One very important and significant movement in the Congo was the history around Kempa Vita. We refer to it as the Antonian movement, and Kempa Vita was also known as Dona Beatriz. She lived from 1682 to 1706 in the Congo. She claimed that the Congolese were capable of the same events as Jesus, Mary, and the saints. She became pregnant and said that the child was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and this outraged the missionaries, and she and her child were burned at the stake for heresy. But her movement was picked up by a man named Simon Kimbangu and continued. Kempa Vita was a popular female prophet in the kingdom of the Congo, and she was a precursor of the prophetic figures of the independent churches and the creator of a movement that used Christian symbols, but it also revitalized traditional Congo cultural roots. Which brings us to a discussion about African independent churches. Many Africans embrace the message that was brought to them by the missionaries about Christianity, but not the messengers. Very often, this was because of the racism on the part of the missionaries and their rejection of African culture and African religious beliefs and practices. African independent churches grew rapidly. By 1980, there were 7,000 different independent groups with 12 million members. And now they're somewhere in the neighborhood of 110 million members, with over 10,000 groups in South Africa alone. There are many forms of African independent churches. For example, some Ethiopian independent churches and Zion independent churches. Some of the characteristics of these independent churches: they have strong charismatic leaders who claim a strong relationship with God. They also emphasize direct communication through prayers, dreams, and possession by the Holy Spirit. Women are also active in the leadership of many of these African independent churches. And a big feature which helps with their popularity and their continued spread is their adaptation to indigenous beliefs. Rather than trying to wipe out, in many cases, the indigenous beliefs, they're incorporated into the practices and the rituals of these African independent churches. An important thing I like to always note too is that many of them have now taken on a missionary role and are operating in other parts around the world. And one of the big places that you can find many of them are here in the United States. Their belief is that Christianity here in the U.S. has veered from the true path, and so many of them find ways in moving here of not only serving the needs of those members of the diaspora that are here, but also their missionary role in helping to convert people and bring Christianity in the West and in the United States back to what they consider to be its original true purpose. We now turn to Islam in Africa. It spread throughout North Africa after its 7th century founding. It came from both the east and the north. The Indian Ocean and the desert facilitated growth because the Arabs were experienced with both environments. Egypt proved to be an important gateway for introducing Islam into North Africa. The West African introduction came from the salt and gold routes, and the East and North African integration of Arabic and indigenous cultures resulted in what is known as the Swahili culture. Islam was introduced into Southern Africa more recently. If we look at some Islamic influences and the way it continues to spread, a part of that is the way in which it both respects and absorbs other traditions, again, not completely insisting upon eliminating of other traditions, but respecting them in some ways, and also in ways absorbing them. The African practice of Islam is greatly influenced by African religious beliefs and traditions. There is often blending of the two. And another factor that has helped with the spread of Islam and is a part of the Islamic influence in Africa is its importance of education. The insistence on education in Africa has helped it a great deal to spread and continue to spread.